The rain battered the cracked pavement outside the small, fluorescent-lit grocery store, each drop a reminder of the world's indifference. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp cardboard and overripe fruit, and the hum of a flickering light buzzed like a trapped insect. At the checkout counter, a young cashier named Lily stood, her shoulders hunched, her eyes downcast, as her manager's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "You're useless, Lily. Can't even scan a barcode right. My dog could do this job better." The words weren't just cruel, they were a public execution of her dignity, witnessed by a line of customers who shuffled awkwardly, pretending not to hear. Among them, unnoticed in a faded jacket and worn sneakers, stood James Carver, a man whose wealth could have bought the entire store chain 10 times over. His heart clenched as he watched Lily's hands tremble, her face burning with shame. He'd seen this before, too many times, and each instance carved a deeper wound in his soul. This time, though, something inside him snapped. He wasn't just going to stand there. Not today. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of standing up for what's right, please hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks for more stories that remind us what humanity can be. Your support keeps these stories alive. James Carver wasn't always a man who hid his wealth. Decades ago, he'd been the stereotypical tycoon. Sharp suits, private jets, a name that opened doors and silenced rooms. He'd built an empire in real estate, turning crumbling lots into gleaming skyscrapers, his ambition a wildfire that consumed everything in its path. But success came at a cost. His marriage crumbled under the weight of his obsession with work. His daughter, Emily, grew distant, her resentment a quiet ache he couldn't soothe. And then, 5 years ago, a car accident stole her from him forever, a loss that shattered his world and left his wealth feeling like ash in his hands. Money couldn't bring her back. It couldn't undo the nights he'd chosen meetings over bedtime stories. So, James vanished from the spotlight. He traded penthouses for a modest apartment, tailored suits for thrift store clothes, and began wandering the world as a nobody, seeking redemption in the places where people's lives intersected with struggle. He wanted to feel the pulse of humanity again, to understand the weight of small moments, to find a way to honor Emily's memory by doing what he'd failed to do for her, see people, truly see them. The grocery store was one of many stops on his quiet pilgrimage. James had a habit of lingering in places like this: diners, bus stops, corner stores, watching how people treated one another when they thought no one important was looking. He'd seen kindness bloom in unexpected corners, a stranger paying for a single mother's groceries, a child sharing half a sandwich with a homeless man. But he'd also seen cruelty, raw and unfiltered, like the scene unfolding now. Lily, the cashier, couldn't have been older than 20. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, and her name tag hung crookedly on her faded blue vest. Her hands moved quickly, scanning items, but her eyes betrayed a fragility, like glass on the verge of shattering. The manager, a wiry man with a pinched face and a name tag reading, Greg, loomed over her. His tirade wasn't just about a mistake, it was personal, a power trip designed to break her down. "You think you're special, huh? Think you're too good for this job? Keep screwing up, and you'll be out on the street where you belong." Customers shifted uncomfortably, some staring at their phones, others at the floor. No one intervened. No one ever did. James's hands tightened around the handle of his basket. He'd seen this kind of abuse before. Managers drunk on their sliver of authority, wielding it like a club to crush those beneath them. It reminded him of his own past, the way he'd once barked orders at employees, too consumed by his own goals to notice their struggles. The guilt of those years gnawed at him, a constant companion. But this wasn't about him, it was about Lily. He could see the way her shoulders curled inward, as if she were trying to make herself smaller, invisible. He noticed the faint redness around her eyes, the way her fingers fumbled with a can of soup, dropping it twice before scanning it. She was drowning, and Greg was holding her head underwater. James's chest tightened with a mix of anger and sorrow. He'd spent years hiding his wealth, using it quietly to help people. A scholarship here, a hospital bill paid there, but always from the shadows. He didn't want recognition. He didn't trust his motives, not after a lifetime of chasing applause. But watching Lily, he felt a pull, a need to act, not just for her but for the part of himself that still believed he could be better than the man he'd been. The store wasn't busy, but the tension at the checkout made it feel suffocating. Greg's voice grew louder, drawing more attention. "You're lucky I don't fire you right now. You know how many people would kill for this job." Lily's lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes darted to the customers, silently pleading for someone to step in, to make it stop. James took a step forward, his heart pounding. He didn't have a plan, not yet, but he couldn't stand by. He'd spent too many years standing by. As he moved closer, he caught fragments of Lily's life in the details. The worn-out sneakers, the faint scar on her wrist, the way she flinched when Greg raised his hand to point at a mis-scanned item. She was carrying something heavy, something bigger than this moment. James knew that kind of weight. He'd carried it since Emily's death, a burden of regrets and what-ifs that no amount of money could lift. He reached the counter just as Greg launched into another tirade. "You're holding up the line, Lily. You're an embarrassment." James set his basket down, his movements deliberate, and cleared his throat. The sound was soft, but it cut through the noise like a gunshot. Greg turned, his scowl shifting to confusion as he sized up the man in the shabby jacket. James's voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that made the air shift. "Excuse me," he said, "but I think you've made your point." Greg blinked, caught off guard. The customers behind James froze, their eyes flicking between the two men. Lily looked up, her face a mix of fear and hope, like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be defended. James didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. There was something in his presence, a quiet authority that came not from wealth but from the scars of a life fully lived. "I've been watching," he continued, "and I think Lily's doing her best. Maybe you could try helping her instead of tearing her down." The store went silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Greg's face reddened, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like he couldn't afford a decent coat. "Who do you think you are?" Greg snapped, stepping closer. "This is my store, and I'll handle my employees how I see fit." James didn't flinch. He'd faced down boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. A petty tyrant like Greg was nothing. But this wasn't about power, it was about Lily. He glanced at her, saw the tears she was fighting to hold back, and felt a surge of resolve. "Your store," James said, his voice still steady, but her dignity. "You don't get to take that from her." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A few customers nodded subtly, the discomfort giving way to quiet support. Greg, sensing the shift, faltered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Get out," he hissed, pointing toward the door. "You're not welcome here." James didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. Not the latest model, but one that worked just fine. He tapped the screen, his fingers steady despite the tension. "Before I go," he said, "I'd like to speak to the owner of this chain. I happen to know him." It was a lie, but only technically. James didn't just know the owner. He'd quietly bought a controlling stake in the company years ago, one of his many investments he kept buried under layers of anonymity. Greg laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You, No, the owner. Sure, buddy. Call him. Let's see how far that gets you. James didn't respond. He dialed a number, spoke briefly in a low voice, and hung up. The store was a pressure cooker now, every eye on him. Lily's hands were still, her gaze fixed on James as if he were a lifeline. The customers whispered, their phones creeping out to record what was happening. James didn't care about the attention. He cared about the girl who reminded him of Emily, of the chances he'd missed to stand up for someone who needed it. Minutes passed, agonizingly slow. Greg smirked, crossing his arms, certain James was bluffing. Then the phone behind the counter rang. Greg's smirk faded as he answered it, his face paling with every word he heard. He stammered, his voice dropping to a whisper, then hung up and turned to James, his bravado gone. They want you to stay, he managed, his voice cracking. The regional manager's coming. James nodded, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here to humiliate Greg, though the temptation was there. He was here for Lily, for the principle of it. The regional manager arrived within the hour, a woman named Carla who carried herself with the efficiency of someone used to cleaning up messes. She took one look at James, her eyes widening in recognition, not of his face, but of the authority behind his name, which he'd quietly shared over the phone. She pulled Greg aside, and though their conversation was hushed, the outcome was clear. Greg was suspended, pending an investigation into his conduct. The customers erupted into murmurs, some clapping, others filming. Lily, still behind the counter, looked at James with something like awe. But James wasn't done. He stayed after the chaos settled, waiting until Lily's shift ended. When she stepped outside into the rain, he was there, holding an umbrella he'd bought from the store. "Can we talk?" he asked gently. Lily hesitated, then nodded, her exhaustion giving way to curiosity. They sat in a nearby diner, the kind with sticky tables and coffee that tasted like regret. Over steaming mugs, Lily's story spilled out. She was 19, supporting her younger brother after their parents died in a fire. The cashier job was all she could find, and Greg's cruelty had been a daily gauntlet, chipping away at her spirit. She dreamed of college, of becoming a nurse, but the weight of bills and grief kept her tethered to this life. James listened, his heart aching. He saw Emily in her resilience, her quiet strength despite the world's unfairness. He didn't tell her who he was, not yet. Instead, he asked about her dreams, her brother, the things that kept her going. For the first time in months, Lily felt seen. The next day, James returned to the store, this time in a suit that cost more than Greg's annual salary. The staff whispered as he walked in, Carla at his side. He wasn't just a customer anymore, he was the man who'd quietly reshaped the company's future. He met with the employees, not as a billionaire, but as someone who cared. He introduced new policies, better wages, mandatory training for managers, a fund for employees facing hardship. For Lily, he did something more. He set up a trust fund for her and her brother, enough to cover college and give them a safety net. He didn't tell her himself, he let Carla deliver the news, keeping his role anonymous. When Lily broke down in tears, thanking that mystery donor she'd never meet, James watched from a distance, his throat tight. He didn't need her gratitude. He needed her to have a chance, the kind he'd failed to give Emily. Weeks later, the store was different. The air felt lighter, the employees smiled more, and Lily was enrolled in community college, her brother thriving in a new after-school program. James didn't visit again, he didn't need to. He'd moved on to another town, another store, another chance to make things right. But the story of what happened spread. A viral video capturing the moment he stood up to Greg, shared across platforms with captions about kindness and justice. It wasn't about him, though. It was about Lily, about the power of one person choosing to act when others looked away. It was about the ripples of a single moment, proving that wealth means nothing if it doesn't lift others up. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of compassion and standing up for what's right, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks for more stories that inspire. And please, leave a comment below, let us know what moment in this story moved you most, or share a time when someone's kindness changed your life. Your stories matter, and we'd love to hear them.